Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. She's part of the Four Timers Club now, and she comes to us from Gardner, Montana. She just got done with the GYE conference, and she finally has a chance to sit down with Stephen and I again to talk about a really fascinating wolf that has been getting a lot of airtime, a lot of media attention due to her. She's been research associate biologist with the Yellowstone Wolf Project for 12 years now. Kira Cassidy joining us once again. How is everything going in Yellowstone, Kira, and how are you doing, more importantly?
Hi, thanks for having me again. Things are going pretty well here. I've kind of been out of town a lot, or at least away from Yellowstone for a lot of this summer, doing some traveling, visiting family, and then also, like you mentioned, I was traveling for that conference, not too far away, just over in Big Sky, but it's nice to be home. It's pretty warm out, not as warm as where you guys are, but it actually has started to feel just in the mornings more like fall, where we get those really chilly mornings with a couple of elk bugles in there. So nice time of year.
Taylor was telling us that I think you guys are in the 30s or 40s in the morning now, a little bit. So that's
first thing.
What's that shift like? Do you notice anything just from your research brain, and then also from just your personal brain? Like, what do you notice that's like something that you enjoy when you shift seasons from when it's been really hot and then when you get into the fall and you start noticing those things, those changes in the season?
I mean, the most obvious thing and the thing that excites me the most is the animal movement really spikes up again, and you start to see whether it's bears or wolves or foxes or whatever it might be. They're just more active when it's cool. They hate when it's hot. The bison don't seem to mind when it's hot, but they were evolved on the plains, so that makes sense. But yeah, it's exciting to see the wolves, especially the pups born this year, are starting to grow their winter coat for the first time. So they get real fuzzy. By October, they'll have that. And so they look a lot bigger than they actually are. And yeah, personally, I kind of like the shorter days. I get a little bit more time to do art and to like catch up on movies because I don't feel so guilty that it's nice outside and I'm inside.
I noticed because we follow you obviously on Instagram, and your artwork, especially the drawings you do with birds, are just really incredible. I mean, is that more of a, like you say, a seasonal thing for you where you have more time? Do you take photographs? I don't know, I'm kind of diverting just for a second, but it's really beautiful stuff that you do. I don't know if I ever asked you this before, but is it pencil work? Is it watercolor? Like, what do you typically do, and how do you figure out what birds or whatever stuff you want to draw? What's the caveat for you?
Most of what I do is watercolor, and that's partly because it's really easy to clean up, really easy to travel with. It's one of technically the hardest to work with because you can't cover anything up. You can't like put white paper back down. But it's been really fun to learn watercolor over the last 10 years or so. And my bird paintings that I've posted occasionally on social media after a trip that I've gone on, I will keep track of the bird species that I see on that trip. And then when I get home, sometimes right away, sometimes months later, I'll just paint that bird list. So one of each species. And I'll look up reference photos a lot of times, and then put the map of wherever I traveled up in the corner. And so I have this whole series from, I think I started in 2015. And so everywhere I've traveled, I've done one of those paintings, and I have, I think, a few dozen trips by this point. It's just a really nice way to kind of like reminisce on the trip and have a little souvenir. I feel like I've practiced birds so much that you have to know bird anatomy pretty well, like how many primary feathers there are, how many secondary feathers, the shape of the bill, and the face, and the size of the eye in comparison to the head. And that's been really fun. I just like the bird stuff so much. Wolves are actually really hard. to paint. And I think that's because people see dogs almost every day in their lives. And so I could get a bird a little bit wrong and most people wouldn't notice, like something related to anatomy. And I did a bat painting one time and it's like everybody loved it because nobody sees bats. So they can't see like when I got something a little bit wrong. But any little thing wrong with a wolf and the human eye just picks it out immediately. So they just become really hard. And I have done wolf paintings before, but it just feels like more pressure. And that's probably because I watch them a lot too. So I'm picking out little imperfections here and there. And it's fun. I would like to do more. I've actually done a handful for a paper that Jeremy published, Jeremy Sundaraj. You guys probably talked to him about that at some point. He asked if I would do a series of paintings about the pack that he had written about, and basically just illustrate that we can tell them apart as individuals. And so the painting helped kind of show people and it ended up in a scientific paper. And I have painted before some other things for like our Yellowstone Wolf book and the Yellowstone Bird book. And so being able to marry art and science has been a goal of mine. But it feels even more so than just doing the science. It feels very vulnerable because art comes from a different place for me. It comes from a very like heart, like special place as opposed to like a very logical scientific mind, which I'm not 100% at all, but mixing those two it's very fulfilling and feels very vulnerable at the same time.
This desert bighorn one is awesome. I would love to have this one for my little guy's room.
Thank you.
I love the chucker looks great too. That's a cool looking bird.
Yeah, some I do really big because I had like a cool sighting of it, maybe really close, or it was the first time I'd seen that species in my life. And then I end up painting like 20 ravens or every single time I go somewhere. So I'll try and do something a little bit different, like a different pose each time.
Yeah, the chucker's cool, man.
I love that. It activates a different part of your brain, and it's always something you like to see the secret lives, I guess, of biologists, because people always, because some will write books and some will, and it's kind of in the same vein. But when you get into painting or drawing or art of any kind, whatever that is, it's just a different part, literally, that you're activating or you're accessing that people maybe wouldn't associate with somebody who is logical, scientific all the time. It's just, it's one thing I always like to bring up is just something different. And it's just, your stuff is incredible. So why not talk about it for a moment? I know the main reason we're talking today, and this is, we're really excited to actually talk about Wolf 907F because we've seen a lot of the media attention surrounding her. She's now 11, correct? She just turned 11.
Yeah. And I've started saying 11.4 because I feel like once you get to that age, we can start going with the decimals in there. So 11.4 officially right now.
So is she now all right, give those who are listening the background. So is she the oldest recorded wolf or however it works in Yellowstone, or the oldest recorded wolf in North America? How, like, where is she now in this pantheon, this list, this legendary type section now because of the age that she's at this point at now 11.4?
Yeah. So the information that we have starting in 1995 with wolf reintroduction, which has now almost hit the 30-year mark in just a few more months, she is the 5th oldest that we have ever recorded during that 30 years. She is currently the oldest alive in the park. And I have the oldest one ever in Yellowstone hit 12 and a half. And so she would have to live quite a bit longer to be the oldest ever in Yellowstone. Of those 5 that have hit 11, her being the 5th one, she, like I said, is the only one currently alive, but she is the only one that has lived in a place in Yellowstone where people can actually see them. The other 4 that reached that kind of uber elder year at 11 or more, they all lived in places in the park where the packs are extremely wary of people. There's no road, there's no places to view them, like the Beckler or the Delta area or Cougar Creek. And they were just not visible, so people don't know their stories. And 907 is the only one of those really elderly ones that people have been watching her entire life. People watch her every day right now. People are seeing her all the time, and she denned a number. I'm getting kind of into the weeds on her, but just to highlight that she has been a feature out there in a place in Yellowstone that is highly competitive, where most wolves don't live that long at all. And all these other elderly ones lasted a long time, but just weren't watched. The oldest wolf that I've ever heard about reached almost 14 years. That was a wolf that lived in Idaho that was studied right after the reintroduction to Idaho. Wow. And that's the oldest one that I know of in the world, like North America or the world, or that people have studied.
So how was her age originally determined?
Yeah, 907 was captured. We put a radio collar on her when she was only 9 months old. And so they're very easy to age at that when they're that young, because their teeth are perfectly white. And we had been watching the pack so much that we recognized her. Pups tend to have like a kind of raggedy coat by the midwinter. And so we just had seen her for month. Yeah.
So when was the last time she was is she captured more than once, or is that the only time?
No, she's one of the few wolves. Usually a wolf will get one radio collar and then will either die before the radio collar goes out, or sometimes we do recollar them. So we'll capture them. I would say maybe one out of every like 4 or 5 wolves will have to be recollared because the battery died or it malfunctioned or something. And then they usually don't outlive the battery on that second collar. But 907 has actually been collared more than once. She has been collared, let's see, she's been collared and captured and handled and recollared 3 different times. The last time was when she was almost 7 years old. And at that time we put a VHF collar on her because the battery lasts so much longer than the GPS collars. She was outliving radio batteries. And so we put that VHF collar on her, assuming like there's no way she can outlive this collar. The battery's supposed to last for 6 or 7 years. And at this point it's been like 3. So I'm kind of thinking like, yeah, that battery better last through the rest of her life.
And of course, there's not that many wolves out there that live to this age. The average is somewhere between 2 and 6 or something like that.
So the average is between 3 and 4. And that's not even counting the ones that die the first couple of months after birth, because we really don't see them until they're a month at least, and sometimes 3 or 4 months old. We don't go into the dens or anything. It's just flying over the dens. We might get a decent count. And then by the time they get to the rendezvous is usually when we actually have a really solid count. And so very likely there are some that die in those first few weeks or first few months. But once they reach that first winter, and we consider them recruited into the population, even though they're not quite 1 year old yet. And of those ones, they usually live to be on average between 3 and 4. It's right around 3.5 is the average. But
so this is really rare.
Yes, that is very different from lifespan. So there's like this big difference between life expectancy, which is at the average for humans in North America or in the US. I think it's in the late 70s now, like a human average life expectancy. But lifespan is actually like how long an animal can physiologically live. And for humans, I think there have been a handful of people that have been documented to reach, like 110, maybe even into the 100 teens. And for the wolves, it would be those wolves like 907, that 11, 12, 13, maybe there was that one that lived to be almost 14, a few months shy. That would be lifespan. So for humans, the difference between life expectancy and lifespan is not that big, from the 70s to somewhat over 100. And for wolves, from 3.5 to like 12 or 14, 3 or 4 times more than the average life expectancy. It just goes to show that they don't generally die of old age. It's usually some kind of what seems to us like some very dramatic or tragic cause. Not those are very like value-based words to describe it, but something that is like an injury. The most common cause of death for wolves in Yellowstone, so keep in mind that's a protected area, are fights between packs. And about 50% of their mortality is caused by those fights. So if you have 100 wolves, 50 of them are going to end up at some point being killed by other wolves, whether it's 1 year later or 5 or 10.
So when you capture individuals, I know you guys take blood tests. I don't know if you do that every time, but when you're testing an animal of this age, are you testing for things like diseases that you can pick up in the blood samples? Do they tend to? I'm curious if, because there's not such a large sample size of animals this age, if there's just an age at which wolves, like dogs, just start to sort of get diseases.
Things that an animal would be that would be age related. We just have so few that reach those ages that I don't know that we have quite enough data for that. Maybe someday. But we do take blood and we spin it down and pull out the serum and test it for antibodies to different diseases. And even the ones that are 8 months old will come back positive for things like parvovirus, distemper virus occasionally that kind of comes through the population every handful of years, adenovirus, toxoplasmosis. We talked to you guys about that a year or two ago, and 907 does have it. She didn't have it as a pup, and then her next capture period, she tested positive for it. But most of Junction does. I think that's the pack that overlaps the most mountain lion dense area in the park. And so I think almost all of, even when they're really young, they've already been exposed to it, where other packs that live in different areas of the park without as many mountain lions, they just hardly have it at all. It's very rare that they're positive anyway. But 907 has that. Let's see. I feel like we tested her.
And do you guys test for things like cancer?
We don't. It's just, I think it would be so rare, and it's not really like a major cause of mortality. So it shows up so rarely. I mean, it's even hard to find in dogs. And so if most of them have died by the time they're 4 or 5, then it's just a non-issue for them at like a population level.
Right.
At an individual level, sure. We have had wolves die of interesting things that we were never able to figure out. Sometimes we will send a carcass in to be tested by a more advanced lab instead of just us doing a necropsy to try and figure out cause of death. Whatever we see in like the veterinary canid world is probably also going on with those really elderly wolves. Like, for dogs, cancer rates are actually fairly high, probably because of things like environmental exposure and diet, which a wolf may be a little bit protected from compared to our domestic dog. But then, things like just tumors and heart attack and, stroke or whatever it might be that an animal could go through. She's probably, I would be shocked if 907 didn't have some kinds of pathology going on, creating some kind of a disease. But she has so far been, hanging in there, and she actually looks pretty good. I saw a video of her. The last time I was out and I saw her was over a month ago at this point, and she was kind of just sleeping and interacting with the pups. But I saw a video someone posted of her recently eating a carcass right next to a grizzly bear, and she looks really good. She only has one eye. I don't think we talked about the second time that we captured her when we were switching out her radio collar. We noticed that her left eye it wasn't like a completely empty socket, but the eye was like deflated and turned. It was clearly not functional anymore. And we're not sure why that happened. Maybe she injured it, ran into a stick while hunting or something. But in studying toxo years later, we did read a little bit more studies definitely needed on toxo, but we did read that if the cysts that usually just form in the brain and in the muscle tissue form on the eye or the retina, it can damage the eye and cause blindness. So it's possible her toxo infection also caused the loss of her eye. But she's been living with that for over 6 years now, and it doesn't seem to slow her down.
Man. Yeah, she's a trooper, this one. My goodness.
Mhm.
What does it speak to? Why, I guess, from your perspective, who's been studying her, looking at her for this long, why do you believe that she's been able to make it this far to 11.4 years old? What are the factors that the average wolf 3 to 4 years doesn't get to this point? She is almost tripling that number, which obviously for anybody who's listening or who has seen this, it's alarming, because you're like, why aren't all wolves living to 11 or 12? And what are the factors that you've seen over the course of time that has led you all to believe that she's been able to go down this path and relatively unscathed, other than obviously missing the eye, but being able to give birth? And we'll get to that in a little bit.
I spend a lot of time thinking about the influence of the pack on the individual, and vice versa, really. But from a pack, at a pack level, she was born into Junction the second year that they formed. So very early on, but it was at a time where had been quite a lot of turnover. So a couple of packs dissolved, and all of a sudden some Mollies females and some males from the Blacktail pack came together and formed Junction. And so they were incredibly competitive with their neighbors immediately, because there was this new pack, a bunch of adults came together. They were kind of all probably looking for breeding partners. And they were kind of set up as a force on the Northern Range at a pretty opportune time. There was like this open territory, and they took it over and really like elbowed out an area. They pushed Lamar Canyon from Slough Creek over into far eastern Lamar pretty quickly. And then 907 was born that next year and has always kind of lived with a fairly large pack. There have been a few times that the pack kind of dipped down in numbers, maybe fewer than 8 or something. But in general, the pack has been, throughout her whole life, fairly large, and for a handful of years was the largest in the park. And for at least one winter was the third largest ever recorded in North America. They reached 35 one winter, and that was in 2020 and 2021, where, there have been years where there are 35 wolves on the entire Northern Range of Yellowstone. And here we were with an entire pack with that many. And so she has benefited from that, because living in a large pack will afford you a lot more protection whenever two packs run into each other and they fight. Like, no one's going to mess with a pack of 35. No one's even going to mess with a pack of 17 and a pack of 18 when that pack of 35 kind of splits for the day and does their own thing. Like, they're still going to beat their neighbors. And so she, I don't want to say that she got lucky that her pack was big, but she was a leader and a member and an important factor in such a important part of wolf life history that probably protected her and her pack mates and set them up to be very successful during that time. That said, she went through a few of those phases where the pack was really small and operated totally differently, avoided their large neighbors at the time, were kind of like going between pack territories. I remember one winter where I think it was just down to 907, her sister 969, and a handful of their pups before they met up with some males from the Prospect Peak pack. And then the pack kind of was able to be rejuvenated. They stabilized again. And even right now, 907's partner, the male leader of the pack, he's one of those Prospect Peak wolves, and he himself is 9 years old. So the pack has been led by these elders so much that I think that must afford them some kind of knowledge and wisdom and experience that they can use to guide the rest of their pack to make good decisions. Don't cross the road right in front of a truck. Don't cross the Lamar River when it's at flood stage. Be careful with the pups, that kind of stuff. Don't get too used to people. All those like little subtle things that they are probably helping their younger packmates learn how to do through showing them the right way to do it. And she's been the leader kind of on and off. A little bit of a unique thing about her is that she never, well, of course, never had to disperse. So that's another thing that helped her. She inherited this leadership position when her aunt died. 907 was 3 years old at the time. But since then, kind of fascinating to me more and more recently because I've been thinking about leadership a lot. And she has switched. So she'll be leader 1 year and then the next year it kind of switches and she was back to being subordinate and one of her sisters or her daughter or something was the leader. And that flip has happened multiple times over the last 8 years or so. And 907 is leader again, but she hasn't been the leader in a consecutive since 2017, her first leadership reign. She kind of went back to a subordinate position a couple different times and is now the leader again. And I saw her in the winter with a number of packmates rushing up to her, licking her face, and her tail was straight up and she was kind of giving this snarl to them. But it was really cool to see her as an elderly wolf. I think a lot of people in their minds kind of assume that when a wolf gets really elderly and probably more frail, they're just not as strong. They don't have they can't hold fat as well, kind of like a really elderly dog. They can't hold fat. They don't have as much muscle mass. And so they're not as physically as imposing anymore. And I think a lot of people assume that those wolves are only going to be with the pack or remain with the pack at like the behest of the rest of them, the strong ones, or maybe just following the pack around and kind of like slinking to keep up. And that's just not the case with her. I mean, she's the boss still.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Just groups of animals with elders amongst them. I mean, even if you just hike enough to see different species out there, you notice that groups of animals with obviously older animals in them just behave like they know what they're doing. They know exactly how to avoid a problem. Whereas if you see groups of animals with just all youngsters, and in a lot of species, it's pretty obvious, especially around fall time, they just don't. They're just not as good as at navigating issues, particularly like just you being a hiker walking around. I mean, if you know birds like grouse, for example, like if you see groups of young grouse, they just stand right in front of you as if they're going to disappear. You see older females in a group and they make a certain sound so you know they're in the group. They are ninjas. I mean, they're just absolute ninja groups of grouse. They know exactly how to avoid whatever potential issues could come up. And I think it's pretty interesting if you get to witness that. Same, I see it a lot in turkeys around here as well, where I live. But yeah, before we move on to the elders part of this list of stuff, or at least more specifically, I remember that toxoplasmosis podcast just keeping me up all night thinking about what it all means, particularly for humans. Are there any updates to that study since then in terms of additional results or continued research, or did it kind of end there for now?
We still have our list of really exciting topics to follow up, whether toxo affects wolf survival, whether it affects reproduction, and also what constitutes good leadership. Because we knew that toxopositive wolves were more likely to become leaders, but are they good at it? Or
right.
So that is still on our list. And my main co-author on that, Connor Meyer, started right after or as we were publishing the toxo paper. He started his PhD on elk up in Banff or near Banff, Yahatinda study area. So he's kind of been focusing on that pretty heavily. And we haven't been able to carve out the time for looking at those next questions. Also, my sister, who now works for Colorado Parks and Wildlife as the wolf coordinator there, she also took that new job and was in the middle of her PhD. And I was hoping to bring her into this project because she's done some amazing survival analyses on Yellowstone wolves. And so we wanted to throw that toxo aspect in there. So it's still on the list, and we'll probably talk about it when we get together for like Thanksgiving, because that's our fun, Thanksgiving dinner topic. But no update yet, except that I got tested and I was negative.
All right.
We still have to do it. I gotta know now.
So you guys
we have to do it.
and,
That's right.
Save the story.
We did make that.
We did say
make
we're
that
going to
agreement.
do that. We actually
Yes, we
do
did.
that. Can you send us a link for how you get a test for that, or how do you test for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just brought
Just
it
a
up.
Google
The general doctor, they were like, all right, we'll throw it in there.
I'll
and
just
see
go
if
down the
it
road to
shows
urgent
it.
We do need
All
to
right.
do that.
We'll do that. Okay.
I mean, you guys are around the wolves so much that's probably your
All right.
reasoning for bringing
Yes,
it up.
that's what I'll say. Not that it was
Well,
not that it was an agreement with a
that
biologist in Yellowstone.
Right.
I did want to bring out too, before we go, kind of circling back to, it's in the same vein with disease, and we're still talking about 907, is that, and I don't know if we've touched on this because we've spoken to you multiple times, and I'm sure there's some overlap, but has there been any thought to her reaching this age with wolves and their physical attributes sort of declining as well? Like we always see in domesticated dogs, certain breeds, we talk about spondylosis. That happens with our pack a lot because of which breed they're mixed with. So spondylosis, bad hips, just sort of the physical things that start to go. Obviously hearing, sight, all of those deals. Is there any traits like that 907 has shown that she's maybe not? Obviously, I would assume she's not as quick as she used to be, not as a great, whatever that may be, but have you seen any physical traits or attributes that have started to noticeably decline as she starts to hit these age markers? And we go ahead with that.
So the most obvious ones that we can actually see when we replaced her collar in the last couple of years, or the last time we did that, was that she weighed a little bit less than she did when she was prime aged, although she had a full belly of meat. So the weights can be really tricky because they could be plus 10 or 15 pounds just because she had eaten that morning, as opposed to 2 days prior or whatever. But it's most obvious in their teeth. Her teeth were very worn, her incisors almost down to the gums. She had a couple of canines that were not totally broken. Sometimes we'll see them broken off like at the gums, but chipped enough to where they had very blunted ends. They start to get quite discolored. They don't build up plaque like dogs do. They don't build up that plaque that you have to actually bring your dog to the vet and have it put under and get a dental cleaning. They just eat so many bones and chew on things that clean that off. But it does get a little bit of discoloration, like staining. And then the wear is not so much on the canines because they don't use the canines for chewing. That's more for like grabbing things. But it starts with those incisors and then the molars as well. Overall, for her age, her teeth looked pretty good. Like she didn't have any major infections or teeth that were like cracked and were painful or anything. Her bite still seemed to be in the proper place. Sometimes a wolf will get an injury like kicked or something or bitten where it will damage the masseter muscle or the skull where those muscles attach in such a way that it will actually shift where the jaw hits, and her bite still seemed to be totally fine and healthy. That, of course, at this point was 2.5 years ago. So any number of things could have happened between now and then. Not to turn morbid on her, but I really hope when she eventually does die that we can go in and examine her body as quickly as possible, so that we're not dealing with like the loss to scavengers or whatever it might be, or decomposition, so that we can see some of these details and try and hopefully tell her life story through her skeleton, because there have to be so many things that she endured and experienced that we will have no idea until we look at her skeleton. I would not be surprised at all if she has broken bones, broken ribs, arthritis, like you're talking about, hip, not hip dysplasia necessarily, but joint issues because of her age. let alone the things that could have been going on with her skull and her teeth. We do have an invasive grass here called cheatgrass, and occasionally the wolves and other animals will get the seeds down in their ears, and they'll actually go all the way down into the bulb. And I don't think we've seen it extreme in wolves yet, but the man who cleans all of our wolf skulls will actually count them and tell us, like, okay, this was quite a lot for this. There were none in this wolf at all, but there were 3 in each of the ear canals for these. And some of the bears have enough that it probably is damaging, or at least causing them to have hearing problems. And so it's possible she's dealt with that. Their territory doesn't have a ton of cheatgrass in it, so hopefully it's not too bad. But I would not be surprised if we eventually have a whole list of all kinds of things that she was living with. And it's try not to feel bad for her, because that's not how wolves, they don't feel bad for themselves. She's having a great time eating a bison carcass right now next to a grizzly bear, also trying to stay safe with one eye. So amazing. But they don't have the pity part of the brain, which is kind of cool.
No, they gotta survive.
Yep.
When I guess this is a good transition to the wolf elder part of it, and I want to go back to something that you were mentioning with 907 also about this change of the guard that she seems to be doing that seems unnatural to a degree. I know that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that wolf pack dynamics obviously shift. I'm sure on a seasonal basis, on a yearly basis, depending upon who leaves, who departs, who dies, who lives, all this other different. So roles obviously shift and change. So as an elder of this pack and having been in charge on and off for the last 8 years roughly, what does that say for you as a researcher in wolf elder, in this wolf elder? Is this a one-off? Is this something that you all have seen at any other point in any other packs? Or is this really just such a comfortable dynamic inside of Junction Butte that the hierarchy doesn't necessarily, and not necessarily a hierarchy, but the role change doesn't necessarily seem to be as a deficit for them at all, because they've been functioning at such a high level for so long?
Yeah. I recently was trying to kind of put some, like, quantify how many times we've seen this intra-pack shift in the leadership. And the first 14 years after reintroduction, so kind of like split halfway between now back all the way to the beginning, we recorded that happening 8 times. And in kind of the more recent, like the last 14 or 15 years, we've recorded it happening 22 times. So it is much more common in recent years compared to those very early years. I don't know exactly the reason behind it. I think in a number of cases we can look back to, like, oh, well, 302 was injured. He was the alpha for a very short time of Druid, but he came back, he was limping badly, and all of a sudden 480 was the leader, his brother. It didn't seem to be like there was a one-on-one fight or anything. It was just something where, like, maybe something happened and he didn't feel up for the leadership position anymore, and this other one took over. And thankfully they lived in a pack where there was a wolf available to do that. And then 302 stayed with the pack as well as a subordinate. We can point to a few cases like that with Junction, where when 907 lost her eye, it kind of coincided with the time where the first time that she went from leader back to subordinate and a different wolf took on a leadership position. So maybe that was related. There have been other times where some of the females in Junction Butte have actually, we've seen them fight, which that is extremely rare. Those cases where we've seen the leadership switch, for the most part, it was either nothing that we saw, or it didn't seem to be associated with, like, some kind of aggression or some sort of stressful event. But the Junction Butte Pack, because they're seen every single day in the summer because of where they den, in view of the road, I think we just see their lives in so much more detail than the rest of the wolves, that some things may seem like anomalies when they might not be. They might be occurring in some of these other packs and we just don't watch them in as much detail. I think it's a combination of that and probably just some really cool dynamics. Like I mentioned, the Junction Butte Pack has at times been really huge. And I think that just sets a pack up for having possibly a little bit more tension between older adult wolves that are staying in the pack. But also, it may be that they just are better at sharing responsibility, which may lead to this like, I was kicked in the hip and I'm in terrible pain every day, not really showing it at all, but not feeling up for eating, dominating, breeding, whatever it might be. And this other wolf is, and a very simple pack with just a male and a female and their pups, they don't have the opportunity. Like, there's no wolf there that can, if the lead female is hurt or sick or whatever, not feeling up for it, there's no wolf there that can take that position. And in a big complex pack with a lot of adults and a lot of experience, there's a number of them that can take on, kind of like fill in that role. Maybe it's temporarily, maybe it's for good, maybe there's some tension there that kind of forces the issue. I think it's a combination of all of those things.
It's wild. I want to also speak to the fact that I do want to go back to the life expectancy and lifespan, because I know there was something you mentioned there that actually, let's just talk about that real quick. Like, I guess go in a little bit more detail about why this is important to understand the difference and what this sort of means as we look at the case of 907 or any of these wolves that get to, I think even if you get a wolf that lives to 8 or 9, you know, we look at the double digit number, I think, and that's the dynamic look at some of these things. You're like, oh my goodness, this animal lived to double digits. And that's always the big thing. But I would feel, and I don't know if this pertains to you or any of your other research partners, that if any animal lives even double outside of when they're supposed to, so if it's 3 to 4, they live to 6 to 8, that's still a massive achievement and needs to be looked at. So what's the difference between life expectancy and lifespan, and why is it important to understand that difference, especially when we're looking at wolves, wolf packs, and 907 in this conversation?
Yeah. So that lifespan is like the maximum age which an animal can physically reach. I mentioned humans,
Right.
110, 115, maybe a couple of years older than that in a few places in the world. But life expectancy for a human, at least in the US, is somewhere in the late 70s. And so the difference between those two things is not huge, an additional 30% or something beyond from expectancy to lifespan. For a wolf, life expectancy is only about 3 or 4. That's because most of them are dying when they're fairly young. The difference in lifespan is, like you talked about, 907's age, or a little bit older even, because we have had a few reach 12 years old, and there was one that was a little bit older than that even. So the difference from like an additional 30% to 3 times longer for a lifespan compared to a life expectancy it really comes down to humans have kind of set themselves apart from most other species. And it was only in the last 100 years, or a couple hundred years really, that child mortality and infant mortality has gone down. And so if we look back at humans a few hundred years ago, and then if you look even further back, maybe 10,000 years ago, infant and child mortality was so high that if you included those deaths into our life expectancy to try and get an average age, you're kind of now looking at like an average age of maybe like 30,
right?
Where if you, don't include all of the children and stuff, there were still people living to be into their 60s and 70s, back in the Pleistocene, but very few of them made it past those infant child years. And so that is much more comparable to the way the wolves live now, because there are many of them that die quite young. Only about half of them make it to sexual maturity at 2 years old. And then survival does go up a bit, because this is very similar with elk as well. I feel like this is a little bit better of an example for people to wrap their minds around. So a bunch of elk are born every year. Most of them are evolutionarily for the purpose of feeding the predators so that some of them live. And if about 20 out of every 100 live, that go on to be recruited into the population, through that first winter, the population is going to stay stable. And so if every single elk calf that was born lived, we'd be in a very dangerous situation of drowning in elk. And wolves just have a different life history style where they have generally one, but sometimes more than one female give birth to an entire litter every single year. And so evolutionarily, they don't know, but evolutionarily, some of them are going to die. Not all of them will make it to maturity. If we expected wolves to all live to be 10 years old, it would only make sense for them to have like one pup a year or something, because then they wouldn't, having so many pups every year means that more of them are put into the population, besides the fact that just having those young, really fit ones that have a ton of energy are very important to pack dynamics as well. But very few of them are going to live to those elder years. And that is part of their evolutionary role in an ecosystem, especially one like Yellowstone that has all these other predators and a number of different prey species, and a very, I like to think of Yellowstone as being a good place to look to try and understand what the wolf system, wolf populations, wolf habitat looked like in this area when there were very few humans, and at least less of a human footprint thousands of years ago, and less of an impact, really. And you just don't get that in many other places. Most other places, wolf packs are living at the behest of humans, and the number of wolves in an area is determined by whatever humans are accepting of. And in Yellowstone, ideally, this isn't a perfect system, but in Yellowstone, ideally, this is like a place that's operating on natural regulation, which includes a lot of death for animals naturally.
Is there any research catered towards this idea of elders in a pack and sort of the part that they play on life expectancy, or the average life expectancy of other individuals in that pack?
Yes, in somewhat of a roundabout way. I think looking at that question directly is going to be something that I think we've just now kind of reached a place where we have some fantastic data to put to that. But part of my master's study was on the impact of pack composition on fights between packs. And we found that when a pack has an elder, they're more likely to win one of those fights, even when they're outnumbered. So it showed that their contributions were the most valuable to the pack in getting through that really stressful scenario. Another paper that we put out showed that when the leader of a pack was killed by humans in some way, usually it was through hunting or illegally or hit by a car even, the pack was much more likely to just dissolve and not be able to get through that period of instability than if like a non-leader was killed. So they're especially valuable to their pack for many different reasons. We are hoping to look at in the future, when a leader is killed, does that change the survival rates of the remaining pack members? That has been found in things like elephants, where when the matriarch is killed, survival goes down for everybody in her herd. Some really cool stuff showing that even in orcas, like when the grandmother, who's no longer having her own calves, but when she dies, the survival of her big adult male offspring actually goes down. Apparently, when the orca males, and these are like 30-foot long, like huge, 30 years old males, but they're her sons, they stay with their pod their entire life, except to go off short term looking for breeding opportunities in other pods. And so they will go off looking for females and their mom usually goes with them. And it's the assumption is that their survival actually goes down because then they have to go by themselves, and the grandma wingman is to protect them. I guess it's like safer, even for a big animal like an orca, it's safer when they're not by themselves.
That is funny.
That is fascinating.
So very similar to wolves, I think the elders are critical for their contributions to the group, their experience, their teaching of the younger ones. And 907 has just been this like really incredible story to follow.
Wow. I didn't know any of that. I didn't know the thing about the elk, which was pretty wild. It's like they're almost overbreeding to protect. I said that's what it seems like. And the orca thing, I definitely heard the elephant thing. The orca thing, I did not. That's wild. That there's like it's like an assisted, mating situation.
Yeah,
that's wild.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. And the elk thing too. I think people have a harder time understanding that with like a big ungulate, but it's a little bit better understood with something like a rabbit. The term breeding like rabbits, they produce a ton of babies because the assumption is that a bunch of them are going to be food for every kind of predator out there, hawks, weasels, cats, all kinds of things. And if even a couple of them survive, then that's a win. Pretty much every animal operates that way. Every prey animal operates that same way to different degrees. Rabbits are a very well-known kind of extreme version of that because of how many babies they do make, but then also how common of a prey item they are. Elk are the same exact dynamic with their predators.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think in the 1960s or it could have been 70s, I don't remember. There was some research came out about, I think it's called the grandmother hypothesis in human beings. It's sort of a similar idea that somehow the presence of grandmothers, even though they're past their prime in terms of having children themselves, they're basically essential to the advancement of human beings, the population. Just the more elders you have around, I think it has something to do with enabling moms to have more offspring and they're relieving some responsibilities. But it's really interesting that in all sorts of species that how integral elders are to just the widespread success of any species.
Yeah, it's actually called the grandmother hypothesis in the orcas as well.
Where do you think, scientifically, I guess, if you look at it, because it seems as human beings, we go through these fluctuations of recognizing or different cultures for sure, different countries, different cultures, different societies, understand the importance of elders and wisdom and knowledge and all the passing down that happens. And in the animal kingdom, it's natural. There is you don't see animals rebelling against parents or grandparents to a degree to not understand how to move, how to survive the next fall or the winter, whatever it is. Is there anything that you all are trying to, or maybe, looking into how human beings can sort of look at animals and understanding how important elders are and translate it to societies and cultures? Or is it something that you think will just stick with, animals and they just know how to do it and it's natural and it's literally getting up to sleep, to eat, to drink, to make more baby, whatever it is, and advance the population? Do you think humans will ever make that connection from your scientific brain? Or is it something that's lost?
I truly believe that we can learn a lot about how to operate well as a society by looking at some of these other species that live in very similar styled societies, like group living, family units, multi-generational, shared responsibilities. And I always try and check myself to make sure I'm not taking it too far. And there are probably certain times that I've done that, but I think wolves are a good example of, it's fairly easy to make a comparison. First of all, because we know that dogs fit so well into human families because they're coming from like a wolfy type of brain. tens of thousands of years ago, and it's so similar that the jump was very small, smaller than most domesticated species. Humans are, and I don't want to say all humans, because there are places in the world where people are living in very similar societies, in those multi-generational spaces, small, tight-knit communities. The US is fairly different, or the US and probably a handful of other places, partly because independence has been so romanticized that how many people really live in the same town as their biological family, let alone the same state. Like, I live over 1,000 miles from my parents. And so while it's probably led to some really wonderful things for the country in like advancements and things like creativity and art and all kinds of things, technology, it has probably set us up to be to have to deal, like, psychologically, maybe sometimes in the back of our minds, with this feeling of like not really, or like missing something, almost like missing a community that we evolved with for so long, that is hard to do now. I mean, it's hard to do my job and spend time with my family. I have to travel over 1,000 miles. And so there's a lot of that going on, kind of like nuclear family is worshipped a little bit, and not so much the bigger and the individual, and not so much like a bigger community. And we probably would do, like, not to get too much into human psychology, but we probably would do better to spend more time thinking about intentional community, and then also just like getting to know neighbors and things that are already right next door, when we can't be near biological family. For wolves, I think they live in these like multi-generational families. As it is, their generation is so tiny. As it
True.
is, it's like 3 years. But for a wolf, that's a very long time. And they live in those societies. And I think looking at them, it would be very easy to like romanticize the way they live. But I do remind myself, like, they run into each other and kill each other if they can, where I can go to the airport and stand in a line with 500 people and no one's killing each other. So like, we have some things really figured out as humans. And we have kind of like advanced beyond this very like what's more similar to the animals that we're talking about. I don't want to say that we need to replicate exactly what they're doing, but we can pick parts of it. Like, we are an advanced enough species that we can take what works and let go of what doesn't. And I think that's what I would like to propose we do with animals like wolves and elephants and stuff. Just pick what works. If we can actually treat all humans in the world like we are one pack, that would be great. We don't want to treat each other like it. That's where you get into kind of like the tribalism stuff, that we don't want to emulate that, like the wolves live. And we're kind of more advanced. We're more intelligent than that. And we can also see animals for like the really fascinating species that they are, and emulate what makes sense and what's kind.
Yeah,
I love that.
Totally.
I did have one more thing. Yeah, that was great. Well put, Kira. I wanted to touch on the last thing real quick with 907 too, about the amount of litters that she's been able to have too. And I know you're getting into this as well. And it's interesting how this sort of weaved into this too, because when we're talking about family and communal, correct me, she's had 9 or 10 consecutive, was it 9 consecutive litters or 10?
She has had 10.
10
This
litters.
last spring was her 10th. The only year she didn't breed was the year that she turned 1. And so she had her first litter as she was turning 2, and she's had a litter every year since.
So what is that for anybody who's listening or talking about that? Because again, as we I guess we're starting to compare humans and wolves now at this point. What a shock. We've seen folks have the ability, as technology and everything has evolved, obviously, we're talking about humans real fast, that people are able to have children more later in life than what I think is more naturally possible. So when we look at a wolf such as 907 and going into the research, I know you haven't finalized a lot of this stuff yet and you're moving into it. Where does this sit about when we talk about menopause? We talk about female animals being able to reproduce at a later age successfully, or at least from what you guys can tell is successful. I guess I would just ask, is this something that is new that you guys have found out that, obviously she's reached this age, so obviously it's sort of a finite sample, but for an animal like this to reproduce 10 consecutive years with, it seems, little to no detriment, what does that mean going forward if we have these wolves that are able to reproduce longer? Are you noticing any diseases, any things like that are coming from these litters? If you guys can do that, I don't know.
Yeah. There's never been any evidence that gray wolves go through menopause. And so it has always been the baseline for them that they can reproduce until death. And actually very, very few species go through menopause or have been proven to go through menopause, where there have been detailed enough studies that show that at a certain age, around a certain age, the hormones will change so dramatically that they no longer ovulate. And that has been proven in humans and orcas, pilot whales, and I think very recently in some larger primates like chimpanzees, possibly gorillas. But that's it. And everything else basically reproduces until death, wolves included. And so it would have actually been more surprising for 907 had she been healthy and at a good weight to not reproduce. And so for her to have pups was really cool this year, but I was not surprised at all. The first few years that she bred, her pups were not very successful. Not very many of them lived. I don't know if it was just 1 year, it was a disease year. So most of the pups died in most of the packs that year. And then in other years, the pack just didn't have great recruitment, fairly low percentages. But then starting in 2020, so she was 7 years old at the time, for the next 3 years, she actually had quite large litters. There were other females in the pack that also had litters, so they were all raising them together. And then last year, she only had one, or she had more, but only one of them survived the summer. And she's still alive. We put a collar on her. It's really cool to see this little, the only yearling in the pack right now finally has playmates. So she's playing with the new pups this year. And then this last spring, 907 had 3 pups. 3 of them, she was just hanging out around the den, and we know what day she went underground. And about 4 weeks later, she came out with these 3 pups. A few weeks after that, one of the pups died, but the 2 are still alive. And then in a really cool event, I didn't get to see it, but I saw some of the videos, and Jeremy described it to me. A wolf that had left Junction Butte Pack, a younger female, had left in March or April. And we figured that she had gone off to try and start her own pack, probably had been pregnant, so starting or giving birth to her own litter. She brought her pups to 907's den from wherever she had them, miles and miles away. And all of a sudden, 907's 2 pups had these 3 pups come in, and all of a sudden they're like playing all the time. Really cool to just like imagine what it would be like as a little pup to have only known your sibling here and the adults that come and bring you food every day, your mom, you're nursing, you've kind of switched to solid food. And then all of a sudden 3 little, siblings essentially are showing up, and now you're a litter of 5 all together. But really, those are 907's grandchildren. So they're raising them all together because the mother wolf that brought them back is 907's daughter. And so really cool to see what is definitely a multi-generational family at this point. 907 being the mother of some of the new ones, the mother of some of the older ones in the pack, and then also some of her offspring having pups as well. That's been really cool to see. And I think, whether she has pups, if she lives to be 12 years old, that'll kind of be mind blowing to me, but it's mind blowing kind of every day that she's alive at this point. It wouldn't be a shock, except that the studies, one of them led by Dan Staler, actually published, I think in 2013, showed that litter sizes go down slightly with age. And so they reach a peak at about 4 years old, and then they go down just because it's harder for the female to probably produce enough milk, to put on enough fat over the winter to during gestation. Maybe they produce fewer eggs that eventually get fertilized during the breeding season. And so just the timing of that can be interesting. The fact that she only had 3 this year when she had 8 3 years ago, that's kind of telling. Her body is probably just not producing eggs to the degree or the exact kind of cocktail of hormones that are needed for her to want to breed at the exact right time during February, according to the health of the eggs as they're ovulating. And so, there's a bunch of factors that we are watching. This isn't a captive facility where we're able to put her under some kind of an ultrasound and look at how many eggs she has left, or look at the placental scars, or even look at pups closely at any point in their life, unless we capture them as adults. So she has been quite successful as a breeder. We've had other wolves that have been far more successful. Usually in those early years when it was a little bit easier, there was a lot of unoccupied wolf territory. We know of at least 5 wolves that we've collared throughout the years that have been her direct offspring, but we are kind of behind on our DNA results right now. We have to send out and get results from, I think, the last 4 or 5 years. And so I expect that there's probably another 5 or 10 wolves out there that are also her direct offspring. Some of them are at this point almost reaching elderly ages themselves. Our cutoff for elderly is 6 years old and older. And so there's a couple of them that are almost at that age, and other ones that are young. I expect that once 907 is gone, she will have many descendants out there, kind of keeping that, not only the DNA of 907 alive and going, but also all the things that she taught them. They'll be teaching the younger ones.
Yeah, she's going to have a long, long lineage. Man, Kira Cassidy, thank you so much for diving into this into 907's life so far. She's still living right now, and just all the other stuff about wolf elders. When can we anticipate? I know you're working on this research with wolf elders. Is there a timeline for that paper or that research to come out and be finalized? I know you're working hard, so I don't want to, there's no pressure, obviously.
No, I was just thinking, if I tell you guys a date, then I kind of have to stick to it. So maybe I should tell you something to kick me into gear. Yeah, it would be, so I have all the data organized, and it's not so much focused on elders, but focused on leaders who are often elders, but not necessarily. Some wolves can be leading their pack at only 2 years old, and trying to figure out the changes in things like leadership tenures through time, whether it's different for males and females, and then also pair bonds, which I find really fascinating, like how many mates a wolf may have in their life on average, and things like divorce rates, which are pretty fast. It's fairly rare in the wolf world, but it does happen. And then whether they mate for life, kind of like that classic phrase that you hear, wolves mate for life. I want to study that and quantify it in a way that can tell us whether they do or not and how often they do. So let's just say I would love to chat with you guys about that maybe next year sometime. I can get stuff analyzed and written up and hopefully submitted somewhere. I did some preliminary presentations on it at this last GYE conference, but to really get it to an exciting place and pretty polished, maybe sometime in 2025.
Nice.
Awesome.
Sounds good. At that point, yeah, Sweet. I love it. No, we can't wait. We always appreciate you giving us the time and just all of your knowledge and all the research that you're doing. It's always great to chat with you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, Kira.
Thanks for having me. And I love talking about 907. She's hero.
No, she's absolutely awesome. Just hang tight while we sign off. House to y'all out there. We'll chat with you all next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.